Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Focal Point here with Andy Stumpf, and we're talking about Gaza and Israel, which is a super volatile subject, which is one of the reasons why I want to talk to Andy, because he's a super volatile human being. Anyways, let's focus on the topic at hand. Just released this morning, Israel killed 3 of its own hostages that tried to escape Hamas's captivity. They think they actually escaped, or they were left behind, and they were running around the town trying to get to the Israeli link-up. Failed to coordinate because they don't know how to coordinate because they're hostages, and they got smoked. I looked at some of the statistics, which I want to get your feedback on, of friendly fire incidents from the Israeli side of them killing themselves, and it's pretty high. And these things happen in warfare. Yeah. I know I specifically have lost a friend in friendly fire, was there during the rotation when he was killed. And I've seen it and heard about it during war. But for the American military, it's like onesies and twosies. There's like a large percentage of casualties in Israel that happen to be friendly fire. What's your take on that? And do you have any experience with that, by the way?
I don't have any personal experience with, we would call it blue on blue or green on green, or blue on green, depending on who you are working with. At a broad level, I am aware of, at the highest levels inside of Naval Special Warfare, at the JSOC level, I am aware that it has happened. It's not necessarily publicly spoken about, and I can understand the reasoning for that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it has happened and it does exist. I think you have to start any conversation about warfare with the realization that it's not binary. And people, I worry, think that as somebody who is in those environments, your choices are you have a good choice or you have a bad choice. And I don't think I've ever seen it that clean. Sometimes it's you have a bad choice and you have a bad choice and several other bad choices. And so you're kind of triaging the options that you have in front of you. So I wish it was binary. I wish it was always black and white. In my experience, it hasn't been. Right now, as far as militaries in the world, the U.S. probably has more experience with sustained combat of the levels that seem to be happening in Gaza. With that experience comes better decision-making, better pattern recognition. So it makes sense that it is less. And I don't know, I'm not an expert on the IDF and how often they are involved in kinetic activities. And you can train as hard as you want to, as realistically as you want to. When the rubber meets the road, as you and I both know, there's a jump between conceptual and practical execution of warfare. So it doesn't surprise me that that is happening. They're fighting in what I consider to be one of the most difficult environments, that urban environment, where it's not even just, you're left and right, it's up and down. And literally in that environment, it could be caves as well. So it's 3-dimensional, it's rubble. You have the IED threat. You have the ability for people to hide into the rubble or deep back into buildings and rooms. It's hard to move quickly. It's hard to provide security for yourself and other forces. It sucks. The accidental loss of life is, I think, always a tough one to deal with. I'm glad that they were open and honest that it happened. I think that's a good indication. I would be concerned if they were trying to explain it away instead of just saying, hey, a mistake was made. But unfortunately, it's kind of in line with what my own experience with warfare has been. It's just not, it's not an operating room. It's not sterile.
Yeah, it's interesting on the Israeli side. What I've noticed about the IDF specifically and all their military speaking heads, they're super transparent about exactly what they're doing. That's part of their campaign. I imagine part of their PR campaign that seemingly is failing, at least for a portion of the country and a portion of the world that doesn't agree with anything they're doing. And when they talk about their engagements, their efforts in trying to reduce civilian casualties, when they show the actual footage of them operating, it's always in daylight. And we never, did you ever do anything during the day? We rarely did anything.
Not by choice. There had to be a compelling reason for us to do so.
Yeah. Because the expectation, right, is if you're doing, direct action, anything, if you're doing movement to contact, anything, you're going to take casualties in the open daylight with all the loopholes and all the rubble like you described.
Well, I think another common misconception in warfare, or a common thing that people are enticed to do, is to underestimate the intelligence or capability of your enemy. And we do AARs after every operation, and in my experience, every enemy we've gone up against, they do them as well. And it's why our tactics have changed, even from how to approach secure and then clear a structure or a compound, people are smart enough to realize, hey, maybe moving in the day is actually safer. You know, these people who became technologically savvy, so they would leave their devices off, but they still needed to move. And so that's what I'm saying. It had to be a compelling reason. If you get an HVT or a high value target that is worth the risk, you know, maybe doing a VI or vehicle interdiction in broad daylight is actually going to be the best tactical move. You have to understand, assess, and mitigate that risk. But if you give me a choice, I'm going to always take the tactical and technological advantage. I'm going to take my night vision goggles, my overhead assets, the IR capability, and leverage it. But again, that urban environment that they're fighting in Gaza, you know, the overhead assets and the sensors, all of that stuff rapidly decreases in its effectiveness as soon as you step indoors in a multi-structure building. So, if you were to ask me to define a difficult battle space to fight in, I would describe something along the lines of Gaza. It's tough.
Yeah, the big controversy here across the entire world right now is the civilian death toll.
Yeah.
And there's a couple issues that I'm having I want to get your take on. One of the main issues I'm having is the proposed now 18 to 20,000 civilians that have been killed, which a third, if not more, including statistics up to a half, have claimed to be terrorists. There is a large percentage of civilians that have been killed, but who to believe, right? The talking specific statistics are coming down from the ministry of Hamas and their media and their propaganda machine, and the media disseminates that like it's fact, including the 500 that came from this hospital. That's part of the tabulation of this 18,000 plus. Now, what Israel is claiming with 20,000+ strikes, very specific strikes, I think half of which are surgical guided missiles versus dumb bombs. Mm-hmm. They're saying they have less than 0.5% of civilian casualties if you look at the numbers per the strike, right? And when you look at the coalition forces across the span of the global war on terror, and it's a 20-year span versus, October 7th since then, they're saying percentage-wise they're doing a lot better job than almost every military in the world, including the United States, where, according to statistics, 462,000 civilians were lost in the global war on terror campaign. I've been on target where civilians were killed.
Same.
I've seen it happen. It's just been a thing that I've experienced, and I think you get that in direct action conflict. What is the acceptable range, and how come there's such a difficult PR story for the Israelis to tell? Even despite them shouting at the rooftops, it's not getting through. We're still having ceasefire protests in LA, New York, across the world. And this doesn't seem to be getting through despite all the statistics we hear.
I think that for most people, the issue is deeper than just the current conflict that is ongoing. And I am not an expert in the region and the history of the region and the relationships between Palestine and Israel. I don't want to claim to be something that I'm not. And another thing is, I don't want to actually tell people what to think either. And so my advice on this topic would be, give it a beat and give it a breath. I don't think, or at least in my experience, the first pieces of information that are reported are generally the least accurate. And I look at those numbers too, and I don't know who to believe because I don't know who's tabulating those numbers. I don't know the authenticity of those numbers being reported. I don't know the motivation behind the individuals or organizations that are reporting them. And I think at the end of the day, we probably won't have an accurate assessment of it until it calms down substantially. So I don't think it's going to calm down and have the ability to really tabulate it until things actually have a moment to take a breath and figure out exactly what happened. And I think that's okay. My concern and I've said this since I started being hit up, as I'm sure you were, pretty much on October 7th. They wanted me to come in and be on a talking head, for lack of a better term, on national media. And I've always said exactly the same thing. Hamas is responsible for the actions that they choose to take or have taken and the consequences from that. Israel is responsible for the actions and the decisions that they make in response to that. And those are different discussions. And I'm not talking about the motivation why one may want to do the other one. Both parties need to be held accountable for their actions, but it's not going to be able to happen in real time. I think the fact that anybody at this point in time with a telephone can be a news reporter and things can go viral, whether or not they are authentic or not, is, I guess, in a way, a beautiful thing, because we can get immediate information from what's happening on the ground, but we don't know whether or not that information is correct. So the only advice that I have to people, regardless of how passionately you believe for either side, and I want to be very clear, I think Hamas is a terrorist organization and they need to be wiped off the fucking face of the earth, for clarity on that. Whatever side of any argument you land on, take a breath before you grip incredibly tightly around information that supports what you believe, absent all other information. And again, I think one of the reasons that we wanted to start Focal Point was to provide a different optic and really avoid telling people what to think. So it's not that the numbers are accurate or that they are inaccurate. I think we just don't know. But they're really powerful because they're large. Women, children, innocent people. It's horrible. I don't know your thoughts on it, but I bet I do. It's like you don't ever want to see loss of life for somebody who is not a willing combatant ready to fight and die for what they believe. But right now there is so much information coming out. And with that volume of information, what it triggers for me is this warning in the back of my head. How realistic and authentic is this? Regardless of how enticing it may be to wrap yourself around it because it aligns with your personal belief, my recommendation would be give it a beat before you tie everything that you believe into those numbers. Because history shows us, the first numbers out of the gate are the least accurate.
Yeah, one of the hangups I have is with the children being killed. And a lot of people have accused me even saying, hey, I never understood what anti-Semitism was. Like, yeah. I'm not Jewish. I didn't grow up in that culture. I don't know what that means. I certainly know the history of anti-Semitism, but I see these things happen, and I talk about, especially the CT threat, the counterterrorism component, because I'm experiencing that. And then all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, I get attacked and called like pro-Israel, and you used to work with Arabs and Muslims. How could you do that? I'm like, what? Like, I'm not picking a side, guys, because I have watched the documentaries on Gaza, and I can get that perspective. I imagine myself, especially being a young man growing up in that environment, why would you not want to fight? I mean, you're in an echo chamber. Two, you're in isolation, and everything around you feels like oppression, despite your upbringing, especially surrounded, in Gaza or the West Bank, surrounded by the Israelis. So I get it. But like you said, there are different perspectives. And if you're just looking for stats to boost your confirmation and to give you those points to yell louder at the rooftops, that's also fine as well. I mean, it's happening all over the country, right?
It happens in this country around gun violence. I mean, how many times have you seen statistics thrown out, and what they don't, the number of deaths when it comes to weapons-related deaths, and what they don't take the time to do is parse out that the 40 to 60% of that is suicides.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why they do that. It's not that the statistic isn't real. They're not dissecting the statistic because they know that it would either soften or change the message. Stats are an amazing thing, and they can help people make decisions. But you have to look, you need to look at the pool of information that statistics come from, because people that I know that are very good at math, I'm not talking about you in this particular instance, they'll tell you statistics can largely be manipulated to get the answer that you're looking for. You can almost reverse engineer them, whether it be the pool that you're pulling from or the way that the timeline that you're bringing them across, the metrics that you pull out of that. They're important, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. Lastly, the three presidents of Harvard, MIT, and UPenn were grilled by Congress. I mean, it's pretty known right now, especially the question specifically whether or not genocide or the call of genocide violated their terms in their code of conduct for their students. It's a pretty clear-cut answer from common sense and reason, but every single one of the presidents, including Liz McGill, who later resigned after this, stood their ground and said, it depends on the context. And it's like, what do you mean context? I'm saying if the person says death to Israel and calls for the genocide of the students, does that violate your code of context or code of conduct? And they were very combatant, and it was interesting because they all played off each other, and they basically gave the same response, and they couldn't give a clear yes or no. And for everybody's who's listening to this, we looked into it. All three of those schools, it is a violation because any threat of bodily harm goes against the violation of those code of conduct. UPenn, I think the president appropriately came out with a statement the following day, but then she resigned later because it probably wasn't good enough as an apology. And then they doubled down on Gay, the Harvard president, because they said she was the right person. She was inclusive, the way that she got there, her story and upbringing, despite the potential right now, they're looking at her record, her academic record, and saying that she might have cheated a little bit. And she went and plagiarized a little bit.
To be honest, I think those people's inability to draw a line in the sand has far less to do with what's happening in Palestine and Israel and far more to do with our society, where people are afraid to actually stand behind what they believe. I think people largely know what they believe. What they are stumbling up against is the scrutiny and the overwhelming ability that people have to just launch a tsunami against you if you publicly state what you believe. And you risk, here's the problem with any belief anybody has. It's going to offend somebody somewhere.
But do you think that, like in those cases, because specifically they do have their beliefs and values that have been on the record. I mean, historically, like especially Gay, her record is all over the place. But when it comes to a question like, does it violate the code of conduct?
It's black and white to me. It's very easy.
Yeah.
They don't want to answer it directly because they're afraid of the potential backlash because of the condition that our society is in. And unfortunately, it's just impossible to please everybody. But certain segments of our society in the modern, time period right now are wielding more power than others, and people are very afraid of that. And it's preventing people, I believe, from saying what they know to be is either right or wrong. They don't want to deal with the consequences. So they try to find a middle ground, and in finding a middle ground, it actually makes the situation worse.
Do you think there's any hope for these elite academia establishments that are, they're harvesting hundreds of millions from billionaires who are funding their schools and their efforts? Do you think there's any hope for them to kind of find and strike balance and focus on academics versus all the political issues that seem to be raveled in?
I think so. I have hope for it, but I think they're going to have to fall on their face a little bit first. And, when presidents are resigning and you can see in the news, extremely wealthy donors are starting to hold back millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. I think there are mechanisms out there that will course correct this, but to bring it into my own life, sometimes you got to work your way through the mistakes that you make to learn the lesson of, okay, I understand what happened and why, and I'm going to try to prevent that from happening again. It just takes time.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your perspective.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed that episode of Focal Point. Current events, giving you perspective. That's the value that we want to provide. If you're interested in all the things you heard, especially at the round table with a lot of perspective from experts in their field and people we want to talk to, make sure you subscribe to the links down below. Focal Point coming to you in 2024. Thanks, guys.